48,000 homes could be built around the Norwich area over the next 20 years. So where should they go? What should they be? And is Norfolk getting the kind of homes it needs? We all need somewhere to live, but is our county getting the right kind of homes in the right places? The councils have put together a plan which suggests we will need 40,000 more homes by 2026 and another 8,000 on top of that 10 years later. Sites have been identified for about 20,000 homes, but not all of those have been built yet. So how can we make sure we're building in the right places and the houses that people can afford to buy? On the panel tonight, Chief Executive of the Broadland Housing Group, Michael Newey. Also with us, David Hook from the Norfolk branch of the Campaign to Protect Rural England, and Dan Grimmer, who's the Public Affairs Correspondent from the Eastern Daily Press. So, David Hook, I know you're worried about these numbers. Why are you so concerned?
Because the allocation of sites for such large numbers of houses is not solving the housing problem. It is not providing the right houses in the right places at the right price for the people who need them. Just to put it in context, 48,500 to 2036 added to the 21,000 built up to 2016 and the windfall numbers will give a total of 75,000 extra homes, and we're not talking Norfolk, we're talking South Norfolk, Broadland and Norwich, which is a population increase at 2.3 per household, the UK average of 175,000 people in the first third of the 21st century. That's another Norwich in the Norwich area. The countryside cannot stand this without significant loss of character, tranquility and beauty.
Dan Grimmer, these numbers change a lot, don't they? We were talking about 37,000 and now we're talking about 48.5. How do they do the calculations?
Well, what there was a few years back, there was a blueprint. It was called the Joint Core Strategy, and that was meant to figure out where the homes should be allocated in the Norwich, parts of South Norfolk and parts of Broadland. So that all got approved, that plan was put in place. But then some consultants have been brought in quite recently, and they've come up with this figure now, having looked at the various factors, of 48,000 homes. So some of those homes will be the ones that are already allocated. But yeah, you're right, and as David says, there's now suddenly a request, if you look at it that way, for the councils to establish places for these extra homes, of which I think there's 8,900 on top of what we're already planning for. Okay, Michael Newey, from your perspective, are they needed, this number of homes?
We absolutely need more homes. I mean, I would say that, wouldn't I, working for a housing association. But across Norfolk as a whole, we've got about 17,000 families on waiting lists for social housing. Many of those would never have envisaged that they would ever want to come and live in a property owned by a housing association or the local authority. But because house prices have gone up so much, they found themselves priced out of the market, and now they're on our waiting list. And we're just not delivering the number of homes that the county needs.
Okay, well, let's hear from Councillor Andrew Proctor. He's the chair of the Greater Norwich Growth Board, who are guiding the process of finding locations for these new homes. He told us why we need to look at why the homes are needed.
Well, look at the concerns as to why, look at the evidence as to why we would actually want to have more housing. I would actually not use the word more housing in perhaps the collective way that it's just demonstrated, because people think, oh, more housing equals lots and lots of things all over the countryside, ruining the countryside. Wrong. The better way of looking at it is more homes. And if you look at that from that perspective of more homes, people want to have their own homes. The demographics are changing, people are living longer, so you've got to cater all that. You've got people who want to have their own homes. So focus on homes rather than just housing. Plus the fact, what we've got so far is evidenced growth in the period up to 2025. What we're looking at is evidenced growth through what's called OAN, Objectively Assessed Needs, of housing requirements, homes for people, and also homes that people can afford as well, bear that in mind, of the next 10 years, the 2025 to 2035 slot.
Councillor Andrew Proctor there. He says it's not going to be ruining the countryside, is he right?
Can I pick him up on two things? Firstly, he talked about the objectively assessed need. Well, that's actually for 39,486 additional properties, not for 48,500. And current commitments already exceed that. So the additional housing is not just to meet the demographics. And that's greater than the demographic need anyhow, because there's an uplift of 3,000 houses in that 39,000. The demographic need is for 36,000. He's wrong, because the options include options for dispersal and a much greater amount of development in rural villages than previously, rural villages that were protected through being outside of the Norwich policy area.
All right, let's bring Michael in.
I think we've got to start talking about, I like the way that the councillor talks about homes, because that's actually what we're talking about. And it's very easy to get lost in numbers, 39,000, 27,000, 45,000. And actually we can also highlight there's about 25,000 properties that are consented right now that haven't been built in Norfolk. So we're just not delivering enough homes. I would disagree with David about rural homes. Half our housing stock is in rural communities, and actually every single one of our houses in the villages across Norfolk that we own, we could let 2, 3, 4 times over, because actually people who have been born and brought up in an area don't want to move to the market town, and certainly don't want to move to Norwich. And so it's how we balance that, how we meet the demographic demand, but actually putting properties in the right place.
And
it's not units, it's homes.
How hard is it to get the land that you need in the right places? Because, I mean, you're building around the back of Carrow Road, aren't they?
We will be building around the back of Carrow Road. We've got 6 sites currently in North Norfolk, which probably are good examples of rural communities. That's where we work very closely with the local authority and identify land that was outside the boundaries of the village that we could get consent on. Frustratingly, from our point of view, it's not just about land, it's about getting the money to work. We don't get the grants from government that we used to do. So we now can only build affordable housing when we also build homes for market sale. Now that's good in one way, in that we are developing mixed communities, as opposed to saying people who fit a certain criteria will live over here and people who can afford their own homes over there. But at the same time, it puts an awful lot more risk on us that we've actually got to sell flats. So Carrow Quay, which is a scheme that starts in January, we'll be building over 100 flats for market sale, and that's making the profit that allows us to build the affordable.
And it's fiendishly complicated, Dan, isn't it? I mean,
well, it is. I was actually going to ask Michael a question, because one thing that I get a lot from our readers is, what is an affordable home? How do you how do you
define that?
What does it really mean?
It's a really good question, and having worked in the sector for over 20 years, I can tell you that there's been about 20 definitions over 20 years. For me, an affordable home is a property that a family or an individual can live in at a cost that does not mean that they have a really poor quality of life as a result. So there's a multiplier. If you're spending really more than a third of your income, actually a lot of private renters are paying considerably more than a third of your income just from your rent, before you even start thinking about utility bills and food bills and everything else. Now, the government changed the definition in 2011. Grant Shapps, when he was housing minister. So social housing rents are roughly about 62% of open market rents up to that point, and we used to have a product called intermediate rent, which was primarily targeted at key workers at 80% of the open market, and actually Grant did away with the 62% and said affordable is now 80%.
Okay, well let's
so you could get lost in the figures. For me, it's a home that the people that can live in it can live it at a cost that they can afford without actually making huge sacrifices in the quality of life.
Can I just clarify our position on affordable homes? We fully support the provision of affordable homes in rural areas. We're not arguing against that, and we support exception sites outside development boundaries, small developments of the kind that you're responsible for, 20, 30 homes in each village would be wonderful. These numbers, I know you say the numbers are irrelevant, but they're not irrelevant, they're huge. If we had 20 or 30 in the 520 parishes in Norfolk, can't do the maths off the top of my head, I think we'd get towards your 15,000 need completely, totally and utterly.
Okay, let's hear from the public, because we've been talking to you out on Gentleman's Walk in the city this week about whether there are enough smaller starter homes for people to buy.
I'm first time buyer myself and just can't afford to buy. Nobody can really, so yeah, not enough at all. But hopefully, with properties on the increase, we should see some more affordable housing.
There needs to be a bit more, I think, now, especially with the prices going up.
I think it's just very hard for the young people to start, and I just think it's just very difficult to just start on the housing market.
Okay, well, I mean, I was looking this morning. I think the average cost of a house in Norwich is about 193,000. That's an awful lot of money for people, isn't it? Are we building enough of the right kind of houses that people can afford?
In my view, probably not. I think we need to build more first-time buyer properties. We also need to see many more shared ownership properties, which is where somebody buys half the property and rents the other half, in effect, from either a housing association or the local authority. Because actually it's that bottom end of the market in price terms that is most squeezed. You know, you're at a multiplier now across the county of 9.4. In other words, 9.5 times your income is the sort of housing market point. And actually that's just beyond people. You know, if you got a young couple wanting to set up, when I bought my first home, it's 3 times joint incomes. It's 9.5 times is just, you know, impossible to achieve.
Do you accept, though, David, that it is sort of supply and demand? If we had more houses, house prices wouldn't be so high.
Yes, obviously the market forces of supply and demand are significant, but the market forces are bringing forth a supply of an average of 1,500 houses per year in Norwich, Broadland and South Norfolk, way below the allocation. So the market does not answer the problems. It provides the houses to the people who can afford them. Okay. The kind of situation, the people that Michael is talking about and who we feel strongly for, the market will not deliver their needs. And we've relied on big allocations with a percentage of affordable homes in them to deliver those needs, and that is a failed model.
All right.
The affordable homes need should be a standalone issue and should be provided for on that basis, and that would solve a lot of the problems.
Okay, well, let's look at a development in the city. A few days ago, a plan to redevelopment an old Methodist church into 20 flats was blocked by planners at City Council because it didn't include 33% of social housing. There's a loophole where developers can get out of that requirement if they say they wouldn't make a reasonable profit by doing so. Simeon Jackson is from the Green Party in Norwich, and they challenge the developers.
Policy is to provide affordable housing as part of any development that's over 10 houses. But often developers do argue that they can't afford that level of affordable housing. This is a loophole within policy we think should be closed. It's obviously right that developers should provide some level of affordable housing within their developments when there's such a strain on the housing market.
So one of those brownfield sites, people want to see those develop more than anything else. So I guess in a way that's a bit frustrating.
Well, I mean, you say about brownfield sites, I mean, and undeveloped ones. There's one right on the edge of Norwich, the Deal Ground, which has been rumbling on now for goodness knows how long. And that's hundreds of homes. So if that could be built, that's the sort of development I think people accept, in that it's on a brownfield site. It's not intruding on the countryside. But the frustrating thing is, for various reasons, that has yet to happen. And I think people would be a lot more comfortable with housing if it is built on that sort of site.
Are there just not that many brownfield sites left in Norwich, though? Or is that a misconception?
I like to pick up, instead of answering exactly your question, I like to pick up what Simeon was saying about Section 106. Section 106 is where there's a planning agreement that you provide homes. We've been saying for the last 25 years that Section 106 should have a formula against it. Instead, you as a landowner want to achieve the maximum value. You as a developer will bid whatever the landowner will accept. And you'll ignore that Section 106, you'll ignore the affordable provision, and then you'll turn around and say, oh, but we can't afford to build the social housing. What we actually need is a statutory measure which says you will provide X, so that when land is being valued, you know that that's got to be social housing.
Okay, all right, thank you very much. Stay with us after the break. We'll be talking more about housing in Norfolk and Norwich and what could be done to meet the demand. Welcome back. Tonight we're asking if Norwich and Norfolk is getting the homes it needs. It's thought that around 48,000 are needed to cope with demand over the next 20 years. So is that too many or not enough? And what kind of homes are needed? My guests tonight are the Chief Executive of Broadland Housing Group, Michael Newey. Also with us, David Hook from the Norfolk branch of the Campaign to Protect Rural England, and Dan Grimmer from the Eastern Daily Press. Well, Chloe Smith is the MP for Norwich North, where many of the new homes will have to be built.
I do think Norwich needs to have more homes. I see this from my surgery week in, week out, where actually people come and explain that they can't afford a home, that they need a place to live, they need a place to bring up their family. I think if Norwich is to stay a great place to live, a wonderful place to bring up a family and to live and work and retire, then actually we do need to turn our attention to having those homes and crucially to having the infrastructure that goes with it, such as schools, such as doctors' surgeries, the kind of thing that means that Norwich can stay a brilliant, livable city.
Chloe Smith there. So she talks about infrastructure. Is that kind of planning being done? That's what these councils are doing, I think, aren't they?
Well, yeah, they are, and they're separate from this process. There are other forums in which the planning is discussed, and they do look at where schools need to be, where GPs need to be. But at the moment, it's going to be quite interesting how this plays out, because where these homes should be built, you've got Norwich City Council. They're going to be very keen to see them built around Norwich. They will argue that's where the infrastructure is, that's where the homes should be built. But then you've got other councils, such as South Norfolk, such as Broadland, that will be making the case that, well, we think they should be dispersed, they should be in the villages, and we'll have to create the infrastructure, but we need them there. We don't need everything in Norwich. And particularly with the A11 corridor to Cambridge, I think it's going to be very interesting as to how that now gets developed by these homes, because there is the potential for the homes to spring up alongside that corridor, I think.
Can we meet demand if we are just building them in the villages, though? Is that enough?
No, absolutely not. You need a balance. You need to build them in the villages, you need to build them in the market towns, and you need to build them in the city. We've got to have a whole joined up approach. I totally agree with Chloe's Smith talking about the impact on families, and we were talking earlier about numbers. There's an awful lot of people who are actually living in the grotty end of the private rented sector, a lot of people overcrowding homes. There's a big argument that if you're a parent nowadays, you can expect your children to be living with you into their 30s, so actually them setting their own household up is really good news, and actually it might need another property, but it's actually not increasing the population of Norfolk.
What are the solutions that we need to be looking at, David?
Within the current commitment, which is already for 40,000 homes, we need to ensure that a greater number of those homes are delivered at the affordable end of the range, particularly social housing. Each village should take some of those, and I would welcome exception sites in all villages. The solution is not to keep increasing the number of allocations. That doesn't increase the rate at which houses are built. They're only building 1,500 a year, and most of those, I looked at the West Norfolk figures with Sir Henry Bellingham a few weeks ago, a very small percentage of those are 1 and 2 bedroom houses. The market is not going to solve the problem.
Yeah.
I think picking up that point though, I completely agree with you that actually large sites being allocated to one developer, if you're a developer with 200, 300 planning plots on one site, you will limit how you drip them into the market, so you can maximise your profit. Not criticising them, because actually they've got shareholders who want to maximise their profit. But if you actually took that 300 allocation and divided it into 10 sites at 30, and you use small and medium-sized developers and contractors to build it, you'll actually build out the supply much more quickly. You'll have much greater variety in the quality of build, in what it looks like and how it fits in. But equally, you've got to then join it up into all the other services needed. And I do think infrastructure is a big problem.
And Dan said that Norwich City Council are going to want a lot of homes in the city because that's where infrastructure is. Do we have to accept that Norwich is going to grow? It's inevitable.
In terms of the environment, concentration has many solid, good arguments as the basis for concentrating growth. Impact on air quality is less, climate change impacts are less. This has already been reflected in the sustainability appraisal, which was published with the options. So concentration has a lot going for it. I think what we need to make clear is the dispersal option isn't just about putting 20 affordable homes into villages. It's about the option 4, which is the big dispersal, is about putting 5,000 houses into 50 service villages, which is 100 per village. Now, service villages are places like Hempnell, Brook, etc. If each of those villages, scattered throughout South Norfolk and Broadland, got 100 houses, that would be too big a change too quickly. The kind of change that I think both Mike and I would agree on this, of 20 affordable houses in each of those parishes, is acceptable. Large housing estates cemented onto those sort of villages is not. So that's where the dispersal option is taking us. It's not taking us to Mike's preferred option, it's taking us somewhere else. So I think concentration plus affordable homes dispersed would be great.
The answer is probably somewhere in between the 20 to 100, if we're honest, because actually there's a lot of villages where you could actually increase the number of homes by 50, 60, and you would not own, okay, you might have to join up on doctors' surgeries and doctors, but you make the pub more successful, you make the village shop more sustainable. So actually there's also that issue about how do you invest. And also you don't just need affordable housing, you actually need housing for people to buy at all levels as well.
OK, well, let's hear again from Councillor Andrew Proctor from the Greater Norwich Growth Board. He told us the need for new homes has been well assessed and the public are going to be spoken to about all of the options.
People think that's horrific numbers, but they're not. It's around about 9,000, and that's on this objectively assessed need. Now, people might think, well, you've just sort of caved in and let people do what they like all over the place with these extra 9,000 homes. Wrong again. That's on the basis of the numbers have been robustly challenged with the process that we're going through of review of the local plan. Again, keep that in mind, review of the local plan. What we're now looking at is saying this is what the objectively assessed need is for the future. Therefore, we need to make sure that people understand why it's being done and consulted on. And there's extensive consultation starting in October this year on, I think, 7 different options of future patterns of growth for the area. And again, don't forget that growth includes not just the homes, but also the economic growth, the jobs that we need for the long term.
Councillor Andrew Proctor. So, Dan, he talked about consultation, and there are going to be a number of options on the table, one of which could even be a new village.
Yeah, one of the possibilities is a new village at Honningham Thorpe. It will be about 1,000 homes there, and obviously that's very near the A47 where improvements are apparently promised.
It's not jewelled in that section,
no,
is it?
No, absolutely not. So if that were to happen, that would be a case where the infrastructure would need to be created. There would presumably need to be a school, there would need to be GP surgeries. But I think with these various options, and I think, as Michael says, I think when it comes down to it, the options that are presented tend to be quite extreme. It can be all in Norwich, all here or whatever. And I think it will end up being a bit of a mix of various different options. I don't think people should get too hung up on it's got to be one of these 7, because there's plenty of room to manoeuvre within those 7.
Is there, I mean, some people just playing devil's advocate might say, oh, well, it's just NIMBYism, you know, it's just, I don't want it in my backyard. Is that what's going on in some areas, do you think?
There's always an NIMBY element in protest against development, but it's not a question of not in my backyard. It's our backyard. It's our county. This county has some very special things. Its landscape and its tranquility are exceptional. We have a relatively low density of population compared with the rest of England. There's a failure really of the government to recognise that regional policy would be a damn good thing. Actually, with a nation where the population is increasing, as it is in the UK, Norfolk, Yorkshire, North Yorkshire, Devon, Cornwall, they're very special places, not just for the people who live there, but for the people who visit. Our biggest industry is tourism, 3 billion per year.
Yep.
We mustn't kill the golden goose. There's something very special about this place. The numbers are too huge, and if I may take one issue with Andrew.
I'm sorry, we're almost out of time. I just want to ask you.
His objectively assessed need is already catered for.
OK. Will these 48,000 houses get built? Do you think it will happen?
Without getting the infrastructure sorted, and by infrastructure, you know, A47 is a really good example. You try commuting in from the Dereham direction into Norwich, and how long it now takes from any route. Without getting the infrastructure sorted, I'm dubious. But the reality is we need a heck of a lot of housing, and we've got to kill off the NIMBY, if you like, but equally not go to overboard. You know, it's really interesting, the 6 sites that we're building in North Norfolk, we had community support for all of them. And that's what we actually need. OK,
all right. Thank you very much, gentlemen. But that is all we've got time for. Thank you to Michael, David and Dan. As ever, you can follow us on Twitter to see what's coming up on future shows and have your say at Mustard This Week. And you can watch all of our debates on the YouTube channel, Norfolk Now. Good night.